The morning light filtered through the glass windows of the small restaurant, falling softly on the wooden tables that still smelled faintly of coffee and yesterday's meals. A young woman in a plain gray uniform moved quietly from one corner to another, her mop gliding over the floor with practiced ease. She worked as if she had done this all her life, methodically, patiently, and without drawing attention. Her hair was tied back neatly, her shoes were worn, and her hands showed the marks of constant work. Yet behind those tired eyes was a calm spark, something unspoken, something no one had ever taken the time to notice. It was still early, and the restaurant hadn't opened yet. The cook was busy in the kitchen. The manager sat at the counter checking the inventory, and she kept cleaning silently, lost in her own rhythm. From time to time, she hummed softly under her breath, barely a whisper, almost like she was afraid someone might hear. The sound was gentle, warm, and full of emotion, like she was pouring a piece of herself into the air. But no one paid attention. To them, she was just the cleaner, the one who made sure everything looked perfect before the customers arrived. She didn't mind. Or at least she told herself she didn't. Life had taught her not to expect much from others. She came to work early, left late, and earned just enough to keep her small apartment and buy medicine for her sick mother. Some days she wished things were different, that someone might ask her how she was doing or notice how carefully she cleaned every corner. But instead, people walked past her like she was part of the furniture. The restaurant itself wasn't fancy. It was the kind of place people visited for comfort. Warm soup in the winter, cold lemonade in the summer. It had soft lighting, wooden chairs, and an old piano in the corner that hadn't been played in years. The manager kept saying it was there just for decoration. Sometimes when she walked by it with her mop, she would pause for a second and glance at it. The piano was dusty. Its keys yellowed with age, but to her it was beautiful. It reminded her of something she had once loved but had lost a long time ago. As a child, she had learned to play on a piano just like that one. Her father used to fix instruments for a living and taught her how to read music before she even started school. She would sit beside him, tiny fingers pressing keys that made her feel like she could touch the sky. But then her father passed away and the piano was sold to pay the bills. Life became about survival, not dreams. Music faded into memory, replaced by work and responsibility. Yet even after all these years, she never forgot how it felt to play. Her fingers still remembered the weight of the keys, the warmth of the sound that came when heart and hands moved together. Sometimes late at night she would imagine herself playing again, on a stage, in a hall, anywhere people would listen. But dreams were luxuries she couldn't afford. When the restaurant finally opened for the day, the noise of customers filled the air. Chatter, laughter, footsteps. She stayed out of sight, quietly cleaning corners and refilling glasses of water when asked. People barely looked at her face, but every now and then, a melody would drift through her mind and she'd tap her fingers lightly against the handle of her mop as if it were a keyboard. Those small secret moments were enough to keep her going. By the end of the day, when the customers had left and the tables were cleared, the restaurant grew quiet again. The manager locked the front door and went to the back office to finish paperwork. The cook left through the side door. She was alone. This was her favorite time, the stillness after the storm. She finished her last round of cleaning, then looked once more at the piano. Her heart beat a little faster. She hesitated. She always did. She knew it wasn't hers, and if anyone found out, she could get in trouble. But she couldn't help it. The pull was too strong. She set the mop aside, walked slowly toward the piano, and brushed a layer of dust off the keys with her sleeve. The smell of old wood and varnish filled the air. She pressed one key gently, a low note slightly out of tune but still alive. The sound made her close her eyes. For a moment it was like she was back in her father's workshop, the walls echoing with laughter and music. She smiled faintly and sat down on the wooden bench. Her hands hovered above the keys, trembling slightly, and then she began to play. The first notes were soft and unsure, like footsteps in the dark. But as she continued, her confidence grew. The melody flowed from her fingertips, smooth and tender, rising and falling like a heartbeat. Each note told a story, of long days, quiet dreams, and a heart that refused to give up. The music filled the empty restaurant, wrapping around the chairs, the tables, the windows. It was beautiful, sad, and alive all at once. She played for herself, not for anyone else. For the first time all day, she wasn't invisible. She wasn't a cleaner or a worker. She was someone who could speak without words, Who could turn her feelings into something others could feel too, if only they were there to listen. When she finally stopped, the silence that followed felt almost sacred. She sat still for a while, her fingers resting on the keys, her heart full. Then she stood up, carefully wiped the piano again, and put everything back in its place. Tomorrow would be another long day, but tonight she had reminded herself of who she was. As she locked up and stepped into the cool night air, she looked up at the stars. The street was quiet, the sky wide and clear. She wondered if life would ever give her another chance to play for real, not in secret, but in front of people who would listen. The thought made her smile faintly. Maybe it was just a dream. But dreams had a way of waiting for the right moment. She didn't know that the moment was closer than she thought. The next morning, everything started the same way. She arrived early, cleaned the tables, swept the floor, and filled the air with her quiet humming. But this time she didn't notice that someone had arrived early too, a guest who had come for a business meeting later in the day. The man sat near the back reviewing notes when he heard the faint sound of music. He looked up, confused. Who could be playing the piano at this hour? He followed the sound to the corner of the restaurant and froze. There she was, the cleaner, still in her gray uniform, lost in the music. Her fingers moved gracefully, her eyes closed, her face calm but filled with emotion. It didn't make sense. How could someone like her play like that? The music was breathtaking, filled with feeling and skill that only came from years of practice. He stood there listening, unable to move. When she opened her eyes and saw him, she gasped and stopped playing. Her face turned pale. She quickly stood up, stammering an apology, but the man raised his hand to stop her. He didn't say anything at first. He was still too stunned to speak. Finally, he managed to ask softly, "Where did you learn to play like that?" She didn't know what to say. She looked down, embarrassed. "Just from my father, a long time ago," she whispered. He nodded slowly, his mind racing. There was something special here, something rare. He could feel it, but she didn't understand that yet. To her, this was just another awkward moment in a life full of them. She apologized again and hurried away, pretending to focus on her work. He stayed for a while longer, thinking. He knew talent when he heard it, and that kind of heart couldn't be taught. As she continued cleaning, she couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. Her hands trembled as she worked. Maybe she had made a mistake. Maybe she'd get in trouble. But deep down, a tiny spark of hope flickered inside her. Someone had finally heard her music. That night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't sleep. She replayed the moment over and over in her mind. The man's expression, the silence that followed her last note, the feeling of being seen for the first time in years. She didn't know who he was or what it meant, but she couldn't help but wonder if something was about to change. For now, all she could do was wait. But somewhere in her heart, the melody she had played that morning kept echoing softly, like a promise she didn't yet understand. The next morning came with the same quiet routine. The restaurant smelled of fresh bread and coffee, and she moved through her tasks like always, mopping, dusting, setting the tables. But her heart wasn't calm like before. Every time she thought about what had happened yesterday, her hands would tremble a little. She didn't know who the man was or why he had looked at her that way. Maybe he was just surprised. Maybe he would tell the manager and she would lose her job. The thought made her chest tighten. She tried to push the memory away and focused on her work. The day went on like usual. People came and went, laughing, eating, talking loudly. She stayed in the background, cleaning quietly, just like always. But something felt different inside her, like a tiny light had been switched on. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop hearing the sound of the piano in her mind. The music had found its way back to her, and it refused to fade. Late in the afternoon, as she was cleaning the hallway near the kitchen, she heard the manager call her name. Her stomach dropped. For a moment she thought it had finally happened. The man must have told on her. She wiped her hands nervously on her apron and walked over. The manager, who rarely smiled, looked at her strangely. "Someone asked about you this morning," he said. "A man said he wanted to talk to you about your music." She froze. Her voice came out small. My music?" The manager nodded. "Said he heard you play yesterday. He'll be back this evening. Don't worry, you're not in trouble, but don't let it distract you. We've got a busy night ahead." He walked away before she could ask more. She stood there for a moment, stunned. The man was coming back. Why? What could he possibly want with someone like her? The rest of the day passed in a blur. She kept working, but her thoughts kept drifting. When she finally looked at the clock, she realized it was almost closing time. The last customers were leaving, and the soft hum of chatter faded until the restaurant was quiet again. She took a deep breath and went to clean the front area. The doorbell jingled and she turned around. There he was, the same man from yesterday, standing at the entrance with a gentle smile. "I hope I'm not too late," he said. She shook her head, unsure of what to say. He stepped closer, his eyes warm but curious. "You play beautifully. I didn't expect to hear something like that in a small restaurant." I couldn't stop thinking about it. She blushed and looked down at her shoes. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have touched the piano. It won't happen again." He chuckled softly. "Don't apologize. You should never say sorry for having a gift." Those words made her look up. No one had ever called it a gift before. To her, it had always been a piece of the past, something she had lost when life became too hard. She didn't know how to respond. The man continued, "I organize a charity event every year, a small concert in town. We raise money to help young musicians in schools. I would like you to play a piece at this year's event." Her eyes widened. "Me?" she whispered. "Yes, you," he said, smiling kindly. "You have something that can move people. I can see it, and I heard it yesterday. You don't need a big stage or fancy training for that. You just need to play from the heart." For a moment she couldn't speak. She wanted to say no. The thought of standing in front of strangers made her stomach twist. She wasn't a performer. She was just someone who cleaned tables and mopped floors. But deep inside, another part of her, the part that still remembered the joy of playing as a child, wanted to say yes. I don't know if I can," she finally said. "You can," he replied. "Just think about it. The event is in 2 weeks. If you decide to do it, come to the community hall on Saturday. I'll be there." He handed her a small card with his name and number on it. Then he nodded politely and left. The door closed behind him, leaving her alone again. The card trembled slightly in her hand. It all felt unreal. That night she lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The city outside was quiet, and the only sound was her mother's soft breathing from the next room. The card rested on the table beside her. She turned it over and over in her fingers. Could she really do it? Could someone like her stand on a stage and play again? The thought scared her, but it also filled her with a strange kind of hope. The next few days passed quickly. She worked her usual hours, but whenever the restaurant was empty, she found herself at the piano again. At first her hands were stiff, but soon the old familiarity returned. The keys felt warm beneath her fingers. She began to lose herself in the music, forgetting where she was. The notes came naturally, soft, gentle, but full of feeling. Sometimes the manager would walk by and listen for a few seconds without saying anything. The cook once leaned out of the kitchen door smiling faintly. Even the waitress, who rarely spoke to her, began leaving the dining area spotless so she could have a few minutes with the piano before closing. They all sensed that something was happening, something beautiful, but not everyone understood. One evening, a group of regular customers came in early and saw her playing. They laughed and whispered among themselves. One of them said loudly, "Look at that. The cleaner thinks she's a pianist now." The words stung like a slap. Her fingers stopped moving. The laughter echoed in her mind even after they left. That night she didn't play again. She told herself it was foolish to dream. Yet when she got home and sat beside her mother, she couldn't hide the sadness in her face. Her mother noticed right away. "What's wrong?" she asked softly. She shook her head. "It's nothing," but her mother wasn't convinced. After a moment of silence, she said, "You know, when your father first taught you piano, people laughed at him too. They said a little girl couldn't learn something so hard. But he told me, music doesn't care who you are or what you have. It only cares if you feel it." Tears filled her eyes. She smiled faintly. "I miss him. He would be proud of you," her mother said. "If someone gave you a chance to play again, don't be afraid to take it." Those words stayed with her all night. The next morning, she made her decision. She would go to the community hall on Saturday. She didn't know what would happen, but she couldn't ignore the chance. Maybe it was meant to be. When Saturday arrived, she woke up before sunrise. Her hands shook as she tied her hair and put on her cleanest clothes, a simple white blouse and black skirt. They weren't fancy, but they made her feel confident. She took a deep breath and looked in the mirror. For the first time in years, she saw more than just a cleaner. She saw the girl who once believed in music. The community hall was larger than she expected. Dozens of people were moving around, setting up lights and microphones. She spotted the man from the restaurant standing near the stage, speaking with someone. When he saw her, his face lit up. "You came," he said. She nodded nervously. "I'm still not sure I can do this." "You'll be fine," he said reassuringly. "Just be yourself." "That's enough." He guided her toward the piano on stage. It was a beautiful grand piano, polished and shining under the lights. She had never played one like it before. The sight took her breath away. She sat down slowly, her hands trembling. He stood beside her and whispered, "Play something small. Just a few notes. Get comfortable." She nodded and placed her fingers on the keys. The first note rang out, clear and full. Then another and another. The sound filled the hall. It was different from the old piano at the restaurant, richer, deeper. She closed her eyes and let her fingers move freely. The melody that came out wasn't planned. It just happened. Each note felt like a step closer to her old self. When she finished, she opened her eyes and saw that a few people nearby had stopped to listen. They were smiling. The man beside her looked proud. "See," he said softly. "You belong here." She smiled back, shy but grateful. For the first time in years, she believed him. As she left the hall that day, the evening sky glowed orange with sunset. She walked home slowly, feeling lighter than she had in a long time. The road ahead was still uncertain, but her heart was no longer afraid. She didn't know what would happen at the event, but one thing was clear. Her music was no longer a secret. It was becoming her voice, and she was finally ready to let the world hear it. The day of the charity event arrived faster than she expected. The town buzzed with excitement as people dressed in their best clothes made their way to the community hall. Inside, lights shimmered above the stage, and rows of chairs filled with people who had come to listen to local musicians. It was the kind of night that felt bigger than life, a night filled with promise, laughter, and anticipation. Backstage, she sat quietly, her hands resting on her lap. Her heart was racing so fast that she could almost hear it over the sound of voices around her. She could see the other performers talking, tuning instruments, laughing confidently. They looked comfortable, like they belonged there. She, on the other hand, felt out of place in her simple outfit and old shoes. She didn't even know how she had ended up here. It still didn't feel real. The man who had invited her came over with a reassuring smile. "You ready?" he asked softly. She shook her head, half smiling. "I don't think I ever will be." He chuckled kindly. "That's how you know it matters. Just remember what I told you, don't play for them. Play for yourself." She nodded, trying to steady her breath. The sound of applause filled the hall as the host introduced the first performer. She peeked through the curtain and saw the bright lights shining on the stage. Her stomach tightened. In a few minutes it would be her turn. The first few performances went by quickly. A young violinist, a local band, a school choir. The audience clapped, smiled, and seemed to enjoy it all. But her nerves only grew stronger. Her hands felt cold and her throat was dry. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "It's just a piano. It's just music." Then she heard her name being called. The applause started again as she walked out onto the stage. The lights were brighter than she imagined, blinding for a moment. She blinked and looked around. The hall was full, hundreds of faces all waiting for her to play. She felt small, fragile, like one wrong note could break her. But she forced a smile and sat down at the piano. Her fingers hovered above the keys. She took a deep breath, trying to block out the noise, the lights, and the weight of all those eyes watching her. For a moment, everything felt heavy. Then she remembered her father's voice, soft and calm, telling her that music doesn't care who you are or where you come from. It only listens to your heart. And so she began to play. The first notes floated gently through the hall, soft and hesitant. But as she continued, her confidence returned. The melody grew warmer, stronger, like it was coming alive. It was a song she had written herself, a story of quiet struggles and silent dreams. Each note carried a piece of her life, from the long nights of work to the quiet moments alone at the piano. The audience fell silent, drawn in by the emotion in her playing. As she played, she forgot where she was. The stage, the people, the lights, they all disappeared. There was only the music. It moved through her like a river, steady and sure. When she reached the middle of the song, she closed her eyes and let her hands move freely. The melody rose higher, filled with both pain and beauty. And when it finally came to an end, she let the last note linger in the air. The silence that followed was thick and deep. For a moment, no one moved. Then the hall erupted into applause. People stood up, clapping and cheering. Some even wiped tears from their eyes. She sat frozen for a second, unsure what to do. Then she looked up and smiled, a real bright smile that came from deep within. The man who had invited her was standing at the back of the hall, clapping with pride. She met his eyes, and for a moment she felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt seen. After the performance, several people came to speak with her. They asked where she had trained, how long she had been playing, and if she would consider performing again. She didn't know what to say. She had never been asked such questions before. She just smiled shyly and said, "I just play because it makes me happy." Later that night, when the event was over, the man found her sitting by the piano, still overwhelmed. "You did more than play a song," he told her gently. "You made people feel something real. That's rare. You have a gift, and it deserves to be shared." She shook her head. "I don't know how to do that. I don't know anyone in music," he smiled. "You know me now. Let me help you." She hesitated. Trust didn't come easily for her. But something in his eyes, the sincerity, the kindness, made her believe him. "All right," she said softly. The next few weeks changed her life in small but important ways. The man introduced her to other musicians, people who loved what they did and supported each other. They invited her to small gatherings, where she played simple tunes in living rooms and coffee shops. Each time her confidence grew a little more. She was still shy, still uncertain, but her heart felt lighter. Music was no longer a dream she hid. It was becoming a part of her daily life again. One evening, after a small performance at a local cafe, a woman approached her. She was older, dressed elegantly with a calm but serious expression. "You have something very special," she said. "Would you be interested in auditioning for a scholarship program? It's for young musicians who don't have formal training but show great potential." Her eyes widened. She couldn't believe it. "Me? I never studied music properly." The woman smiled gently. "That doesn't matter. What matters is that you feel it. You play from the heart. That's something you can't teach." She didn't know what to say. The idea of going to a music school seemed too big, too impossible. But she promised she would think about it. That night she walked home with her heart racing. The cool air brushed against her face, and she looked up at the stars. The same stars she had seen so many nights before, but tonight they felt closer. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, life had more to offer. The next morning at the restaurant, she went about her work as usual. But now people looked at her differently. Some customers had seen the video of her performance that someone had uploaded online. They whispered about it, smiling and pointing her way. She blushed whenever she noticed, not sure how to handle the attention. Even the manager seemed kinder than usual. He told her, "You brought a bit of fame to this place. That piano of ours finally got to sing again." She laughed softly. It felt good to hear that. The piano, once just a piece of furniture, had become a part of her story, and she, in some way, had become part of its. But beneath the joy, she also felt pressure. People now expected her to do more, to go further. And that scared her. She wasn't used to being seen or admired. She had lived in the shadows for so long that the light almost felt too bright. One evening, she sat alone at the restaurant after everyone had gone home. The old piano stood quietly in the corner, waiting. She walked over, sat down, and placed her hands on the keys. For a long time, she didn't play. She just sat there thinking about everything that had happened, the applause, the strangers, the opportunities that seemed too big for her. Then she whispered to herself, "Don't forget why you started. Don't let fear take it away again." And she began to play. The music was soft, simple, but full of emotion. It spoke of gratitude, of new beginnings, of the quiet strength it takes to believe in yourself. The sound filled the empty restaurant just like before, but this time she didn't feel invisible. She felt whole. When she finished, she looked up and smiled. Life still wasn't perfect. There were bills to pay, long shifts to work, and an uncertain future ahead. But she had her music back, and that was enough. Somewhere deep inside, she knew that this was just the beginning. The world had finally heard her voice, and she wasn't going to let it fade away again. The next day felt like a blur to her. She barely slept that night, replaying the scene over and over in her mind. The way everyone had turned to look at her. The shock on their faces. the older man who walked toward her, his kind yet serious eyes fixed on hers. She could still hear his voice asking her to play again. Not here, but at the event the following evening. It sounded like a dream, or maybe a trick her tired mind had made up. When she arrived at the restaurant that morning, everything seemed strangely different. The same floor she mopped every day felt heavier under her feet. Her co-workers kept glancing at her, whispering quietly among themselves. She knew they must have heard something. Maybe the man had told the manager. Maybe she was in trouble. Her heart raced as she went about her usual tasks, trying to stay out of sight. By afternoon, her manager called her to the back office. She braced herself for bad news, hands trembling slightly as she opened the door. But instead of an angry face, she was met with a curious smile. The manager leaned forward and said, "I heard you played for the guests last night. They can't stop talking about you. One of them wants you to perform at the charity event tonight. Do you want to do it?" Her first thought was to say no. She didn't belong in fancy places filled with people who wore suits and jewelry. She was a cleaner, not a performer. But something inside her whispered differently. This might be her only chance, a moment she would never get again. So she nodded, though her voice shook when she said yes. The manager smiled again and said the event organizer would send a car to pick her up in the evening. She didn't know what to wear or how to act. She didn't even own nice clothes. After work, she rushed home, her mind spinning with worry and excitement. Her small apartment felt even smaller that day. Her mother, still weak but always observant, noticed her anxious energy right away. "Something's happened, hasn't it?" her mother asked softly. She told her everything, how she had been caught playing, how the guests had listened, and how she was asked to perform at the event that night. Her mother's tired eyes filled with tears, but they were happy ones. "You have been hiding your gift for too long," she said. "It's time people hear it." She tried not to cry. Her mother gently helped her find a dress, a simple blue one she hadn't worn in years. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and fit her well. She brushed her hair, tied it back neatly, and put on her old black shoes. They were worn out, but they were all she had. Her mother touched her hand before she left and whispered, "Play like you do when no one is watching." When the car arrived, her heart pounded so loud she thought the driver could hear it. The city lights flickered through the window as they drove. Her hands rested nervously in her lap, and she stared at the blurred reflections of buildings passing by. The venue was a grand hall glowing with warm lights. Music and laughter spilled out from inside as elegantly dressed people mingled and smiled. The driver opened the door for her, and she stepped out, feeling suddenly small in the sea of polished shoes and glittering gowns. Someone greeted her at the entrance, a woman from the event staff who smiled politely and led her backstage. She could hear the sound of an orchestra tuning their instruments and the soft chatter of the audience beyond the curtain. Her stomach twisted with nerves. The producer from the restaurant appeared then. He looked pleased to see her and reassured her gently. "Just play what comes from your heart," he said. "Don't think about who's watching." That was easier said than done. When she peeked through the curtain, she saw a hall full of people dressed in their best clothes. They were laughing, sipping drinks, and clapping politely after each performance. Her palms were sweating. She wondered if she should run away. What if she made a mistake? What if they laughed? But before she could think further, the announcer called her name. The sound echoed through the hall. Everything inside her froze for a moment. She took a deep breath and stepped into the light. The grand piano sat in the middle of the stage, shining under the warm glow. It looked beautiful and intimidating at the same time. The crowd turned their heads toward her. She could feel their eyes on her plain dress, her trembling hands. She sat down slowly, trying not to make a sound. For a few seconds, the hall was silent. She placed her fingers on the keys, and the first note came out soft but clear. Then another. Slowly, the melody began to form. The same one she played in the empty restaurant, the one that always helped her escape from the noise of life. Her nerves started to melt away, replaced by something familiar and comforting. Her fingers moved faster, smoother with every passing second. The audience grew still. The music filled every corner of the room, flowing like water, gentle and powerful all at once. Some people stopped talking mid-sentence. Others leaned forward in their seats, drawn in by something they couldn't quite explain. There was emotion in every note, the kind that spoke without words. It told stories of struggle, hope, love, and pain all at once. As she played, she forgot where she was. She wasn't in a grand hall anymore. She was back in the quiet restaurant after hours, or in her small apartment beside her mother. The music carried her there. When she reached the final note, her hands hovered above the keys, trembling slightly. The sound faded, leaving behind a heavy silence. Then the hall erupted into applause. It started softly but grew louder and louder until it filled the entire space. People stood up, clapping, cheering, some even wiping tears from their eyes. She blinked, not fully believing what had just happened. Her chest ached with relief and disbelief. For the first time, she saw what her music could do, how it could touch others. The producer walked on stage, smiling proudly. He shook her hand and whispered something she would never forget. "You were meant for this." She wanted to reply, but words failed her. All she could do was smile through the tears that threatened to fall. When the applause finally faded, she stepped off stage, still dazed. People came to greet her backstage, strangers thanking her, praising her, asking where she learned to play. She didn't have fancy answers. She just told them she loved music. That was all she ever needed. After the event ended, she sat quietly in the corner, holding a small bouquet someone had handed her. The scent of fresh flowers filled the air. She looked around the now empty hall, the same piano still sitting in the spotlight. Her heart was full, not just of joy, but of something deeper, something she couldn't put into words. For the first time, she felt seen. When she returned home, her mother was waiting awake, eyes shining even before she said a word. The moment their eyes met, her mother knew. She smiled softly and said, "I told you they would hear you one day." She sat beside her mother, still in her blue dress, holding the flowers in her lap. The night felt quiet, peaceful. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for once she wasn't afraid. Her music had found its place, and maybe, just maybe, so had she. The morning after the performance felt unreal to her. She woke up before the sun, still wearing the faint smile she had fallen asleep with. For a moment she wondered if everything that happened the night before was only a dream, but when she looked over and saw the flowers sitting on the table beside her bed, she knew it was real. The applause, the lights, the grand piano, all of it had truly happened. Her mother was already awake, humming softly while preparing tea. The soft sound of the kettle whistling filled their small apartment. When she walked into the kitchen, her mother turned and smiled as if she had been waiting to see her reaction. "You look different this morning," her mother said gently, like someone who has finally found her place. She laughed softly, feeling a warmth rise in her chest. Everything around her looked the same. The old curtains, the uneven floor tiles, the quiet hum of the city outside. Yet everything felt different. She didn't know what would come next, but something inside her told her life had just changed. Later that day, she returned to the restaurant. The moment she stepped inside, every pair of eyes turned toward her. Her co-workers, who usually passed her by without a word, smiled and clapped. Even the manager, who had always been serious, patted her shoulder proudly. Someone had printed a photo from the performance and taped it near the counter. She blushed and tried to hide her face, but deep down she couldn't stop smiling. The older man, the music producer, came by later that afternoon. He walked in quietly, but the room seemed to shift when he did. He greeted her with a warm smile and said, "You have no idea what you did last night. People are still talking about you." She looked at him, unsure what to say. "I was just playing," she said shyly. He laughed softly. "You weren't just playing. You were speaking through your music, and the world needs to hear more of it." He explained that someone from the charity event had shared a short clip of her performance online. It had spread quickly, gathering thousands of views overnight. People from different cities were asking who she was, where she came from, and how they could hear her again. She was stunned. She had never even thought about being known. All she ever wanted was to play. Now the idea that strangers across the country were watching her felt unreal. The producer continued, "I want to help you record your first song. Nothing fancy, just you and the piano. People will feel it just like they did last night." Her hands trembled slightly. No one had ever offered her something like that. She nodded, still too overwhelmed to speak properly. He told her they would start the next day at a small studio downtown. That night she could hardly sleep again. The thought of recording her music filled her with both excitement and fear. She wondered if she was really ready. What if it didn't sound as good as it had in the hall? What if the magic was gone? The next morning she arrived at the studio. It was a quiet place with white walls and a single large piano sitting in the middle of a soundproof room. The smell of polished wood and faint coffee filled the air. The producer greeted her kindly and told her to take her time. "Just play like you're alone," he said, smiling. "Forget about the microphones. Just play for yourself." She sat down, took a deep breath, and let her fingers find the keys. The first note rang softly through the room, and then another. Slowly, the melody began to grow. Gentle, calm, full of the same emotion that had carried her through her hardest days. It was the sound of quiet strength and hope. When she finished, there was a silence so deep she could hear her own heartbeat. The producer looked at her, speechless for a moment. Then he smiled. "That's it. That's all we need." Within days, the recording was shared online. People from all over began to comment, sharing how her music made them feel. Some said it reminded them of lost dreams. Others said it helped them find peace. She read every word, tears welling up in her eyes. It was more than she ever imagined. Soon the media began reaching out. Local newspapers wanted to tell her story. A television show invited her to perform, but she remained humble, always returning to the restaurant to work when she could. The piano at the corner of the dining room had been tuned and polished now, and sometimes during quiet hours she would play softly for the guests. People came not just for the food anymore, but for the music that filled the air with calm and wonder. One afternoon, while she was cleaning the floor, a young girl approached her shyly. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old. The girl looked up at her and said, "I want to play like you someday." She smiled, kneeling to meet the girl's eyes. "Then never stop trying," she said gently. "Even when no one is watching, keep playing." The girl nodded seriously, clutching her little notebook as if holding on to a promise. Weeks passed, and her name began to appear in music circles. Invitations to perform in different cities came in, and with each event more people discovered her gift. But no matter how big the stage got, she never forgot where she started. The dimly lit restaurant where she had mopped floors and played to an empty room. At one particular event, a journalist asked her what kept her grounded despite her sudden rise to fame. She thought for a moment before replying softly, "Because I know what silence feels like. I know what it's like when no one listens. So every time someone does, I play like it's my first chance all over again." The word spread just as quickly as her music. People admired not only her talent but her humility. She wasn't chasing fame. She was sharing something pure, and that honesty made her story even more powerful. Months later, she returned home one evening to find her mother sitting near the window, smiling proudly. "You've made so many people happy," her mother said. "Do you see what your music can do?" She nodded, tears filling her eyes. "I just wanted people to feel something real," she whispered. Her mother reached out and took her hand. "And they do. You remind them that beauty can come from anywhere, even from the hands of a girl who once mopped floors." She held her mother's hand tightly, feeling the weight of those words. The truth of them settled in her heart. The world was finally hearing her, but it wasn't because of fame or luck. It was because she had never stopped believing in the quiet power of her own sound. As days turned into weeks, she began preparing for her first solo concert. The same producer who had discovered her stood by her side, guiding her through every step. She practiced tirelessly, sometimes losing track of time, sometimes playing late into the night. Each melody felt like a new chapter of her life unfolding through her fingertips. The night before her concert, she couldn't sleep. The excitement was mixed with nervousness. She walked to the small piano in her apartment and played softly, not to rehearse but to calm her mind. Her mother listened from her chair, eyes closed, letting the music fill the room. When she finished, her mother whispered, "No matter what happens tomorrow, you've already made me the proudest mother in the world." The next evening would mark a new beginning, not just for her music but for her entire life. As she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she thought about everything that had led her here. The long nights, the loneliness, the forgotten dreams, and the simple sound of a piano in an empty restaurant. She smiled to herself. All of it had brought her to this moment, and though she didn't know what the future held, she knew one thing for certain: she would keep playing. For her mother, for the girl with the notebook, for everyone who had ever felt invisible, her music would speak for them, just as it had once spoken for her. The night of her first solo concert arrived like a dream she had been waiting her whole life to live. The city lights shimmered outside the Grand Theater, and the sound of people gathering inside filled the air. She stood backstage, her heart beating fast, her hands cold despite the warmth of the lights. The same blue dress she had worn the night of her first performance had been carefully pressed and altered, now fitting her like it was made just for this night. Her mother sat in the front row, smiling proudly, her eyes full of quiet joy. The hall was filled with hundreds of people. Some knew her story from the internet. Others had come simply because they had heard the name of a girl who once mopped floors, but now played the piano like a dream. The murmur of voices and shuffling of programs filled the air. She stood behind the curtain, breathing deeply, trying to calm her trembling heart. The producer, now her mentor and friend, placed a hand on her shoulder. "Remember what you told me the first time we met?" he said softly. "You said you only wanted people to feel something. That's what tonight is about. Just let them feel you." When her name was announced, the audience clapped warmly. She walked onto the stage, every step feeling both heavy and light. The grand piano stood waiting under a soft golden light. She sat down, her fingers hovering above the keys, and looked briefly toward the crowd. For a second, her eyes met her mother's, who nodded encouragingly. That single look was all she needed. She began to play. The first notes rose gently, echoing through the hall like a quiet whisper. Each sound carried emotion, each movement of her hands telling a story. It wasn't just music, it was her life. The lonely nights cleaning the restaurant, the hidden moments she had spent playing in the dark, the small hopes she had kept alive in silence. All of it came pouring out through the melody. Her fingers glided across the piano, weaving sorrow and beauty together in a way words never could. The audience sat still, not daring to move. The music seemed to hold them in place, pulling them into her world. Some closed their eyes, some held their breath. Others leaned forward as if afraid to miss a single note. The hall, once filled with chatter, became a place of shared silence and emotion, and in that silence her heart found peace. When she reached the final part of the song, her fingers slowed, the notes softer, fading gently like the end of a story. The last sound lingered in the air, tender and fragile, before disappearing completely. For a few seconds there was nothing, no sound, no movement. Then the applause began. It started with one person, then another, until the entire hall erupted into cheers. People rose to their feet, clapping, shouting her name, calling for more. She looked up, tears glistening in her eyes, her heart overwhelmed. She stood slowly and bowed, unable to stop smiling. Her mother stood too, clapping harder than anyone else. In that moment, everything she had ever dreamed of came true. After the concert, she was surrounded by people. Journalists, musicians, fans, all wanting to meet her, to thank her, to tell her how her music had touched them. She tried to answer every word with kindness, but her mind was still floating somewhere between disbelief and happiness. When she finally found a quiet corner, the producer approached her again, smiling. "You did it," he said. "You moved them all?" She smiled softly and replied, "It wasn't just me. It was every note I ever played alone when no one was listening." That night, after the crowd had gone and the lights began to dim, she walked back onto the empty stage. The piano still sat there, the keys catching the faint glow of the remaining light. She touched them lightly, as if to say thank you. The hall was quiet again, just as it had been before the performance. But this silence was different. It was full, alive, echoing with everything that had just happened. Her life changed quickly after that night. Invitations came from places she had only heard about in dreams. She was asked to play in cities she had never seen, to collaborate with other artists, to record an album. Yet through it all, she stayed grounded. She still visited her old restaurant sometimes, playing softly when the evenings were quiet. The piano in the corner had become a small symbol of hope for everyone who worked there. Customers often asked, "Is the girl who used to mop floors really the one playing in those big concert halls?" And the manager would always smile and say, "Yes, that's her." Despite her growing success, she never stopped being who she was, humble, gentle, and kind. She gave part of her earnings to local music schools, helping children who couldn't afford lessons. She visited hospitals, playing for patients who couldn't leave their beds. Every time she saw a young person watching her play with awe in their eyes, she would tell them the same thing her mother once told her. "Play like you do when no one is watching." One day, she received a letter. It was from a little girl who had come to the restaurant months ago, the one who had told her she wanted to play like her someday. The letter said, "I started piano lessons. I play every day now. I hope one day I can make people feel what your music made me feel. She read it several times, tears forming in her eyes. That letter meant more to her than any award or recognition. It reminded her why she had started playing in the first place. Years passed, but her passion never faded. Her mother's health grew weaker, and as time went on, she spent more evenings at home playing soft tunes beside her mother's bed. The room would fill with gentle music and warm light, and even on the hardest days, her mother would smile. One quiet evening, after finishing a song, her mother looked at her and whispered, "You gave your gift to the world, and it gave you everything back." Those were words she would hold close forever. When her mother passed away peacefully a few months later, she felt a deep emptiness. But instead of letting grief silence her, she poured it into her music. Every concert after that carried a piece of her mother's spirit. People said they could feel something in her playing, a kind of warmth, a quiet sadness that made the music even more beautiful. One evening, years after her first concert, she returned to that same hall for a special performance. It was the anniversary of the night that had changed everything. The seats were full again and the lights glowed softly. As she walked onto the stage, she looked around and felt a wave of gratitude. She sat down, her hands resting on the piano keys, and whispered softly, "For you, Mama." The music began, a gentle, graceful melody that spoke of love, loss, and hope. The audience listened quietly, many unaware of the personal story behind each note. But she knew, and somewhere deep in her heart, she felt her mother listening too. When the final note faded, the hall fell silent once more, and then the applause returned, the same kind that had once lifted her from the shadows of invisibility. She stood, bowed, and smiled, her heart full. The journey that began with a mop in one hand and a hidden dream in the other had led her here, to a stage, a piano, and a story that had inspired countless others. As she walked off stage that night, she didn't feel like a star or a celebrity. She simply felt like herself, the girl who loved music. And she knew she would keep playing for as long as she lived, because her music wasn't about fame or applause. It was about connection, about reminding people that even the quietest hearts can create the loudest echoes when given a chance. And somewhere in the crowd that night, a young girl sat watching her with wide eyes, holding a small notebook against her chest. Maybe one day she would take her place on a stage like this. Maybe one day her music would move others too. As the lights dimmed, the sound of clapping filled the hall once more, and she smiled, knowing that her story, the story that began with a mop and a song, would keep inspiring long after the final note faded away.